Step by step, the ascent proceeded, the vagabond printing the dune slope softly, spreading his weight evenly. The human figure moved deliberately up the sand's great curve, finding the slope gradient that would support his full weight, avoiding places that would slide out from under a careless footfall. And as the dune crest lowered before his point of view, as he ascended toward its long, bowed curve, the vagabond, the desert rat, was able to see the fractured line of rock faces exposed in the distance. They stood unhazed by dust, and still above the shimmering layer of hot morning air. It had only now begun to build. The human figure at the dune crest stood alone, robed against the pitiless elements of his world, wisely attired to blend with this desert and prevail in life by moving in its ways. Yet, unwisely, he moved alone under the sun, beyond the aid of companions should he fall. And to the eyes of a desert community, this was the mark of moral retrogression, the sign a man had been banished for a crime. He walked alone because no one would have him, perhaps, or because he unwisely chose a haunted road no companion would dare walk. A lone wanderer could blend into cities, and no one would remark. People could travel short distances between settlements by themselves on foot. But out here in the wild, when the heat builds and communities take shelter from the direct sun, no human being with a family or connection would stand between sky and sand without the companionship of at least one other. No, this one had a bad past, they'd mutter. Don't let him draw too near. The man at the dune crest saw no living thing. The curdling air could hide small animals that hopped or slithered distantly, but his gaze canted again to that wall of rock. It was freshly exposed, the vertical surface that remained after the shock of a deep tremor had split the land 2 nights ago. Its color was richer and darker, almost reddish against the sun-washed beige of the land. It was the identification of that specific landmass that made it significant. It was known to contain reservoirs. At least one still contained water, a trove beyond price in the wild. Even now, wild things were on the move, soon to gather at that rock face, there to see if the reservoir's deep fluid wealth, inaccessible to diggers from above because of a heavy rock stratum, could be accessed from the side. While the vagabond took shelter to wait out the day, that row of cliffs had borne the fierce heat and glaring light. When he arose from his fitful rest, he saw they'd already begun to share the eroded washout of the surrounding lands, less red now, though their contours were still sharp and fresh. Still relatively dark with the newness of their exposure to the day, though the vagabond noted with weary foreboding they were less dark now than they had been at morning. How much time ago had that been? The sun's position suggested a passage of 7 hours. Still early for this land's denizens to move out in the open, except this was a matter of water acquisition. That simple prospect lent motivation, counseled urgency, so the solitary traveler rose to his feet and began to move. In the shimmering air of late afternoon, at the mounded bases of steep, curving landforms, along the crests and crescents of rippling dust dunes, the land seemed to undulate. Experienced eyes could separate the sinuous coils of rising air from the things here that had actually moved, parse the intentional, deliberate motion within this thermal blanket of atmosphere. There were other feet that trekked this land, other beings that moved with purpose, seeking the shadowed sides of massifs and mesas to move along, other persons and thought processes that had made their conclusions about that rock wall over there and the probability that an oasis might possibly open from within the rock. Despite the unending cycle of blasting hot days here, water still held its own presence, but most often that was at a molecular level, bound within matrices of basalt and sandstone, too thinly diffused to yield even the substance of a single droplet. The prize for the dwellers of this land was to find a reserve of water, enough water to flow in the open if it were released. Water in such quantities was most rare, but the cliff line appeared to have a store of it, a sealed reservoir below the exposed brow of basaltic capstone, probably behind the large darkened recess high up. It was visible even at this distance, an indent just left of a protruding vertical rise that ran up the cliff wall. Perhaps that rise could be climbed. The recess, blank and ovoid, stared sightlessly. The question now was, if the thirsty residents of the land were on the move, who would reach it first? Who could cut the rock? And indeed, did a reservoir of liquid wealth wait within it? "Better late than never," growled a rough voice beneath the hood. But will we get any? The vagabond traveler of dry wastes did not reply. Those words were directed to another human form now alongside the speaker, a third party swaddled in what looked like burlap sacks. The heat writhed among them, alive in its own right, though the sun had fallen far down the western sky. Almost overhead towered the rough wall of exposed rock, its broad fractal geometry planing left and right from a vertical ridge that ran up its face. Its summit stratum was still in one piece, a heavy overburden of weathered rock like a brow or forehead, but the layers below cleared down to the base, a broken jumble of edged boulders. Among them stood a crowd of water pilgrims, 50 strong at least, parties from a parched village some leagues off, the traversers of a caravan from between villages that now arrived at this place, pairs or clusters of individual forms that had seen or heard about this rock wall and knew or hoped on what to expect. Reservoirs of untapped water within the rock were commonly understood to exist, yet rarely discovered. The anticipated find would wet many throats. Even now a gang of riggers was scaling the rock face, ascending to a pocket situated just below the overburden. How far in would they have to cut? The many eyes of the gathered stared up through the shimmering air as the riggers ascended. At the back of the line, the vagabonds stood, apart from another gathered knot at a dune crest, the hopefuls who thought they'd arrive early, only to be beaten by everyone else. Outcast once more. The realization was like direct exposure to the beating energies of the noon sun. One never truly adjusted. The crowd swelled in its murmurs as the ascent riggers hammered stepways in the vertical rock and ran rope through eyelets in a line up its face. They produced hoses and translucent sacks, better able to harvest any runoff. An adjacent villager in a dirty whitish burnous raised a hand against them, shook a large empty wineskin above their heads. Two of the rigging party stood to obstruct the villager. From the dune crest their conversation was indistinct, but the angry tones of confrontation were plain. Other voices in the crowd raised. Some words carried. "Have you a monopoly now?" The mood was becoming that of an angry sea. On the dune crest, the vagabond turned to his companions, audibly spoke to them, ventured this observation: "Will there ever be enough?" There were yet more stragglers joining them now, a party of creosote planters whose job was to encourage plant growth. They appeared to have had not much luck. Cracks sounded from the shallow indent up the cliff. One of the riggers had begun to cut stone with a power tool, and the vagabond saw the scene in a new way. Through the riggers climbing in single file up the ropes, past the maddening, thirsty crowd milling restlessly below, to the rock face itself. Beneath the brow, the indent had fallen into shadow. The whole aspect looked disturbingly like that of a giant face, delineated in stone and shadow. The people were its supplicants, but it seemed, in that moment, stoically indifferent. The sun still beat on them from its place on the horizon, and a dusty wind had picked up and drove on them from the desert. The sound of a restless sea they may have made, but they were far too dry here. And now gusts of hot, moving air began to obscure them with its own voice, gasping over crescent sands, whipping loose sleeves, buffeting bodies, and buffeting that tall face of cliff rock. A sirocco, a simoom, the hot winds blew under multiple names. They hissed with the voices of dust and dune, roared against upright deflections of stone, moaned with the tenor of the time, and whipped through the milling, agitated crowd at the foot of the cliff. Their eruption of rage against the riggers had gone quiet, but it had not subsided. Now it was focused through 50 sets of eyes that bored into the cliff wall, up where one of the riggers was himself endeavoring to split the stone and release gouts of imprisoned fluid for capture and distribution. Chips from the rock wall arced from the biting edge of his tool and deflected from facets of cliff face as they fell. In an effort to not antagonize the crowd, the rigger was attempting to make the cut debris land away from them. Not all the pieces did. On the dune crest across from the front edge of this drama, the vagabond, the lone traveler, braced himself against the surge of wind and pulled his hood protectively against the sting of sand particles. The creosote planters just behind him conversed quickly amongst themselves. It seemed he was not alone in his epiphany. They too saw in the cliff wall the features of a tall, stony face. In the rising wind, it seemed not to be as mute. The desert's buffeting stream of air was giving the stone wall the makings of an indistinct voice. The human element, busy in its own concerns of the moment, appeared mostly to not have noticed how face-like the cliff wall looked, or to hear any voices beyond the arguments, explanations, or speculations about the allocations of the water to be captured, if it was indeed within the stone. Would the riggers exact a price? That was generally undoubted. What would best serve as a means of payment? Probably they would withhold some measure of water from each allocation as a worthy price for their troubles, or there'd be other barter arrangements. But these considerations were all moot. So far, the power tool yielded only rock chips and dust. The rigger had cut into the wall far enough that he was reaching up to his elbows to continue, and to the vagabond it appeared as though that human figure, small against the cliff face, had excavated a tear duct for the shadowed recess of stone that served as an eye. The sun was going down. The hot wind was picking up. The patience of all, workers and observers, was ebbing with the day, and the rigger at the top of the ropes withdrew his power tool with a curt pull and pulled an object from his belt. His teammates on the rope below called up to him, indistinctly but with audible dismay. His reply was lost to the wind, but its tone communicated a sudden impatience, signaled in the abrupt gesture of casting the object into the hole and rappelling away from it suddenly, taking shelter at the convex crease where the cliff's planes met. A sudden flash and a puff of dust, a concussive bang, died away on the wind's surge that caught the shrapnel and dispersed it away from the people. The wind's voice, it seemed, was the wall's voice. The desert stone that towered over the crowd appeared to be trying to address them. In the hiss of dust and the woof of boulders, that tall face uttered a message the people were unable to understand, but on the dune crest it seemed to come in tones of unutterable pity. And from the carven duct, a rivulet of open water built and fell. It ran from the shadowed recess of the eye down the rock face to the people of the land.